You lift your arm to wave or reach for something, and there it is again, that loose swinging motion on the back of your upper arm, moving a split second after the rest of you stopped, almost like it has its own delay built into it. And what most people instantly assume is fat is actually something far more specific happening under the surface, something that does not respond to dieting the way you expect, and does not fix itself with time. In fact, for many people, it slowly worsens, even if their weight stays stable, because the issue is not volume, it is structure. And once you understand that difference, everything about how you approach this changes completely. The tissue on the back of your arm is supposed to be anchored, supported, and able to glide smoothly across layers. But over time, due to lack of targeted movement, poor circulation, and subtle biochemical shifts, those layers begin to lose coordination. They start to bind slightly, then more firmly, until what was once flexible becomes sluggish and heavy. This is where that delayed motion comes from. Not extra mass, but poorly functioning tissue that is no longer being actively maintained. Your body depends on constant micro-movement and blood flow to keep tissue responsive. When that flow slows down, the smallest vessels stop delivering nutrients efficiently, and waste removal becomes delayed. That creates a quiet buildup inside the tissue spaces, not something dramatic or visible at first, but enough to change how the skin behaves. Gravity does the rest, pulling on an already compromised structure and revealing the problem every time your arm moves. What makes this more deceptive is that you can still feel generally healthy. You might even exercise regularly, but if the back of your arms is not being specifically activated, it becomes a neglected zone. And neglect over time always shows physically. Here's where things get more interesting. The body has repair mechanisms that are constantly working, but they rely on stimulation without stimulation. Those systems downshift, they conserve energy and reduce output, which means collagen renewal slows, elasticity drops, and the tight supportive network under your skin begins to weaken gradually and silently. Most people never notice this transition until the visual effect becomes obvious, and by then they assume it is too late or too difficult to reverse. That assumption is exactly what keeps the cycle going, because in reality, the moment you begin reactivating those dormant processes, the body responds surprisingly fast, but only if you target the right mechanisms directly, not randomly, not occasionally, but with intent and consistency. And here's the part almost no one expects. The first signs of improvement are not visual, they are sensory. The tissue starts feeling different under your fingers, less dense, more responsive, slightly warmer. That warmth is increased circulation, returning to an area that has been undersupplied for years, and that is your first real signal that change has started, even though nothing looks different yet. Most people quit right here because they expect immediate visible tightening, and when it does not appear, they assume nothing is happening. But internally, everything has already begun shifting. And if you stop at that exact moment, you lose the progress before it becomes visible, which is why what comes next matters more than anything else you have tried so far, because this is where most people unknowingly sabotage their own results without realizing it. The next phase is where you begin actively reversing the condition instead of just understanding it. And this is where precision becomes critical, because random movement will not fix a specific problem. You need targeted activation of the exact muscle that has been underused for years. The triceps is designed to extend the arm, but in modern daily routines, that motion is rarely loaded properly, meaning the muscle never receives enough resistance to maintain tone. When muscle tone drops, the support system under the skin weakens and the surface has nothing firm to rest on, so it begins to drape instead of hold shape. Restoring that support does not require extreme workouts, it requires correct loading done consistently and controlled. The key is to create tension in a narrow range, keeping your elbows close to your body so the effort does not shift elsewhere. This isolates the exact fibers responsible for lifting and stabilizing the tissue from beneath. As you repeat this movement, something subtle begins happening. Blood flow increases, not just during the exercise, but afterward as well. And that prolonged circulation is what starts feeding. The repair process, oxygen levels rise, nutrient delivery improves, and the cells responsible for maintaining tissue structure become more active again. This is not instant, but it is reliable, and it builds with every session. However, there is a detail almost everyone misses, and missing it slows progress dramatically. The muscle needs to be prepared before it is loaded and reset after it is used. Without that sequence, efficiency drops and recovery becomes incomplete. Stretching before and after creates a cycle of contraction and lengthening that pumps fluid through the tissue like a natural filtration system, removing stagnation and replacing it with fresh supply. This is where the transformation begins accelerating, because now you are not just activating muscle, you are restoring the entire environment around it. And when that environment improves, the surface starts reflecting those changes. The skin begins to appear slightly firmer, not because anything was removed, but because everything underneath is functioning again properly. And just as this starts becoming noticeable, many people make a critical mistake. They either reduce intensity or skip days thinking the problem is solved, but what they do not realize is that the body is still in a rebuilding phase, and stopping here interrupts that momentum, causing the tissue to slowly fall back into its previous state. And this is exactly the point where consistency separates visible results from temporary improvement. Because what happens next depends entirely on whether you continue or hesitate. Now comes the part that determines whether the change becomes permanent or fades away. And it goes deeper than movement alone, because your body's ability to rebuild structure depends heavily on internal support systems, especially those that regulate collagen. Production collagen is what gives your skin its firmness and resilience, and without enough of it, no amount of external work will fully restore tightness. The body produces collagen continuously, but that production is influenced by multiple factors, including nutrient availability, hormonal balance, and one of the most overlooked elements, exposure to sunlight, which directly affects vitamin D levels. When vitamin D is insufficient, the cells responsible for generating collagen reduce their activity, meaning even if you stimulate the area physically, the rebuilding process is slower and less effective. This creates a hidden limitation where effort does not match results, and most people never identify why correcting this does not require extreme measures, but it does require awareness. Getting your levels checked and maintaining them within an optimal range supports every other step you are taking. Because now your body has both the stimulus and the resources needed to repair efficiently. As this internal support improves, something interesting begins to happen, not just in your arms but in other areas as well. The skin appears more stable overall. Joints feel slightly stronger. Recovery becomes faster, and the sense of heaviness in previously stagnant areas starts disappearing. This is because you are not fixing a single spot. You are improving a system that affects multiple regions simultaneously. And this is where the real shift occurs the moment you realize that what looked like a localized cosmetic issue was actually part of a broader pattern. And by addressing it correctly, you are influencing your entire body's structural health. And just when you start noticing these wider changes, another question naturally appears: how far can this improvement actually go? And whether the results you are seeing now are just the beginning or the peak of what is possible, because what comes after this stage depends on one final adjustment that most people never even consider. Yet it is the one factor that can either multiply your progress or quietly limit it without you ever realizing why. As you continue applying the method, something subtle but extremely important begins to reveal itself. The tissue that once felt heavy and unresponsive starts reacting faster to movement, almost like it is waking up after a long period of inactivity. And this is not your imagination. This is the direct result of improved neuromuscular connection, which simply means your brain is now communicating more efficiently with the muscle fibers that were previously underused. When this connection strengthens, the muscle does not just contract, it contracts with better timing, better coordination, and more complete engagement. And that changes everything, because now each repetition you perform delivers a stronger signal deeper into the tissue. This is where many people unknowingly plateau, because they keep repeating the same motion without increasing the quality of that signal. They go through the movement, but the intensity remains the same, and the body adapts quickly to repeated low-level input. Once adaptation happens, progress slows and then stops. This is why a small adjustment becomes critical at this stage. Instead of just completing repetitions, you begin controlling the tempo, slowing down the movement, especially during the lowering phase, because this is where the muscle experiences the greatest tension under load. This controlled resistance creates microscopic stress within the fibers, not damage, but a trigger that signals the body to rebuild stronger and more structured. And as this rebuilding continues, the internal support beneath the skin becomes denser, more resilient, and better able to hold its shape against gravity. At the same time, circulation continues improving, but now it is not just about blood flow. It is also about lymphatic movement. The lymphatic system is responsible for clearing excess fluid and waste from the tissue spaces, and unlike blood circulation, it does not have a central pump. It relies entirely on muscle movement to function efficiently. So every time you contract and release the triceps, you are essentially assisting a secondary drainage system that has likely been sluggish for years. And as this system becomes more active, the subtle swelling that contributed to that soft-hanging appearance begins to reduce gradually. Not overnight, but steadily. And this is where the visual changes start catching up with the internal ones. The skin looks slightly tighter, the contour becomes more defined, and the delayed motion you once noticed starts shortening until eventually it becomes barely noticeable. But just as this improvement becomes visible, another challenge appears, and this is where most people lose momentum. Not because the method stopped working, but because their perception changes. They see progress and assume less effort is required, which leads to inconsistency, missed sessions, reduced intensity, and eventually a slow reversal of the gains they worked to build. What you need to understand here is that the body prioritizes efficiency. It will maintain only what it is regularly asked to maintain, nothing more, nothing less. And the moment the demand drops below a certain threshold, It begins conserving energy by reducing that adaptation, which means the firmness you are building is not a one-time fix. It is a maintained state that requires ongoing stimulation. But here is the part that makes this sustainable rather than exhausting. As the tissue improves, the amount of effort required to maintain it becomes lower than what was needed to build it in the first place, meaning once you reach a certain level of firmness, you are no longer working to fix a problem. You are simply maintaining a healthy functional system, and that shift in mindset is what allows long-term consistency without burnout. However, there is still one more layer to this that most people completely overlook, and ignoring it can quietly slow down your results, even if everything else is done correctly, because beyond movement and circulation, there is a mechanical property of the tissue itself that determines how quickly it responds to change, and that property is directly influenced by something you probably do every single day without realizing its impact on your progress. This next factor is not exercise-based, and it does not require extra time, but it has a measurable effect on how your tissue behaves under tension and how efficiently it recovers after stimulation. It comes down to how often your arms remain in a fixed position for extended periods. Whether you are sitting using a phone, working at a desk, or even resting, your posture influences circulation and tissue compression more than most people realize. When the arm stays in a bent or supported position for long durations, the flow through certain menotic becomes restricted, not completely blocked, but reduced enough to slow nutrient delivery and waste removal. This creates a mild but persistent state of stagnation, which counteracts the progress you are trying to build with targeted movement, and over hours and days, this adds up, making your sessions feel less effective. Even though you are doing everything correctly, the solution is not complicated, but it does require awareness, breaking those static positions regularly, allowing the arm to extend fully and move through its natural range, resets circulation, and prevents that subtle buildup from returning. This is why short bursts of movement throughout the day can sometimes have a disproportionate impact compared to one long session, because they keep the system active instead of allowing it to fall back into a low flow state. And as you start incorporating this, you may notice something unexpected. Your arms feel lighter even outside of exercise, and that lightness is a sign that fluid is no longer accumulating in the same way it was before, which directly reduces the downward pull that contributed to sagging in the first place. At the same time, the skin begins responding faster to each session because it is no longer working against a constant background of stagnation, and this creates a compounding effect where each effort builds on the last, instead of having to overcome resistance every time you start. But just as this begins working in your favor, another variable quietly enters the equation. And this one is often mistaken for a completely separate issue, when in reality it is deeply connected to everything you are doing here, and if left unaddressed, it can limit how far your results go, even if you remain consistent with every other step. And this is exactly where most people get confused, because the signs are subtle and easy to misinterpret until they become strong enough to demand attention. And by that point, correcting them requires more effort than it would have earlier, which raises an important question that most never think to ask until much later in the process.